After World War I, German industry was struggling, as was the case in many countries. During this period, engineering leaders began a campaign to blame intellectuals, intellectual leadership, what they saw as intellectual elitism, along with capitalism and the emerging American technology as the main reasons for the relatively poor state of the German economy. After nearly a century of living in the shadows of the academic, intellectual elites who resided in the universities and the German state bureaucracies, the German engineers began to manifest resistance and become more assertive. For example, some engineering leaders, such as Karl Weihe, an engineer who became somewhat of a public intellectual, displayed overt hostility towards conceptual or theory-based ideas or idea development. Weihe claimed that it was wrong to think that technology or technics was somehow the product of abstract thinking. On the contrary, in his view, it was a direct realization of human spirit, a direct realization of German Geist, a direct, quote, infusion of spirit into labor power, end quote. The unfolding of quality new technology was a direct indication of human progress from this point of view. An important piece of evidence for this idea that new technologies belong to humanity, national progress as a whole, rather than to the individual developers, came from a long-standing German resistance to the idea and practice of patents. This is a very interesting contrast here. Because with German industry competing internationally through quality rather than through price, one would think that establishing patent protection would be a relatively routine, a relatively non-controversial activity, especially in a country run by lawyers. But there's a different context here. Such was not the case. In Germany, the issue was, how could one patent something that was a direct expression of German spirit? To patent something was in principle to classify it as personal property, not something that exhibited German spirit. Now, a patent law was passed during the Second Empire, but it was not in order to protect individuals. And I'm going to quote here Manegold on this point at some length because I think it nicely describes the issue. Quote, in the discussion that preceded the patent law of 1877 and touched a wide public as well, inventors and engineers, following the socially influential value system underlying the prevailing notion of education, were regarded as mere executors of an imminent technical progress that occurred of itself. Now think about this term here. They were executors of an imminent technical progress emerging from the inside out, occurring of itself. Quoting again, therefore, they could not rely on a principle of intellectual ownership. Indeed, when the patent law was finally enacted, it was not on the grounds of intellectual property, which is a juridical construction of legal theory, but solely on the grounds of economic and national political arguments. In other words, we needed patents to protect the country as a whole, not to protect the individual inventors. From this point of view, quoting again, mere inventors and discoverers could nearly always be interchanged and replaced, contrasting sharply with the American idea of the creative inventor, because they did not concern themselves with the world as a whole, in contrast with the writer, the artist, and the true scientist. They could just simply be interchanged. End quote. Note that not until the Third Reich, the Third Empire of the 1930s, which would become a favorable time for engineers, would federal law formally grant legal rights to individual inventors and industrial scientists, a provision that had been key to American patent law over 130 years earlier. And it was not until the 1950s that Parliament finally passed an employee inventor statute which would grant employees legal rights to inventions. This resistance to patent law in the German context really indicates the extent to which Germans considered capitalism, which was as an economic system built on the maximization of self-interest, an actual threat to corrupt the purity of German techniques, the purity of German technology. Some engineering leaders argued that capitalism made American technology, it was capitalism that made American technology devoid of quality due to its emphasis on cost reduction and the use of unskilled workers in manufacturing. For these engineers, America lacked an appreciation for the deeper cultural meanings of technology. For example, Heinrich Hardensatt, in his book, The Capitalistic and the Technical Man, contrasted capitalism with German engineering as chaos is distinct from order. Now, this is before chaos theory became harnessed as a form of order, and then late 1980s and early 1990s. Hardensatt claimed, for example, that a turbine combines, quote, the lawfulness of spirit and the timeless functional relationship of nature with circles of immaterial cosmic energy and steel's inner order of tension. Can you feel the focus here on Geist emerging through the material of new techniques and technology? As the historian Jeffrey Herf summarized, quote, with obsessive repetitiveness, engineers such as Hardensatt asserted that technology was German, spiritual, cosmic, complete, whole, permanent, formed, and orderly. And as such, it was non-capitalistic. End quote. In other words, technology was becoming like reason from the 19th century, and to a significant extent like the classical music and other high cultural forms from the 18th and the 17th centuries. One of the main vehicles for disseminating these new ideas was the new journal, Technology and Culture, which is distributed by a newly emergent professional society, the VDDI, which had been organized by the graduates of the higher technical institutes. In fact, between 1914 and 1937, the membership of this society grew significantly, from something on the neighborhood of 4,000 engineers to in the neighborhood of 10,000 engineers. During this time as well, many German engineers were drawn to the political economic theories of fascism and practice of fascism because of its active anti-intellectualism. Fascism here referring to a fervent nationalism with authority concentrated in a single leader who would stand for the whole. The challenges of realizing a fervent nationalism for the benefit of all appeared to justify, from the point of view and the perspectives of the supporters of fascism, the concentration of power in one leader, because this leader would stand for all rather than for the traditional aristocracy. From this point of view, only the concentration of power and authority in one individual, it seemed, could achieve the dramatic change, the dramatic transformation in the class hierarchy that seemed to be necessary. At the same time, the new realization of spirit that would come through technology would be reserved only for indigenous Germans. In this sense, then, German engineers played a significant, even a key role in the rise of National Socialism. Adolf Hitler and the Third Empire, or the Third Reich. World War I had been a war of the empire and alliances of nation states, either in support of the empire or opposed to it. The end of the empire had brought the establishment of this republic in Germany for the first time, and the introduction of citizen-based rule. National Socialism continued this trend of empowering the lower classes. It's important to recognize that Hitler came to power in the 1930s, during the Depression, at a time when the Weimar Republic was experiencing massive unemployment, as was the case in much of the world. Between 1930, for example, and 1933, 1/3 of all German engineers were unemployed. So think about this concept of National Socialism or Nazism. In the 20s and 30s, the word socialism called attention to a form of government built around the people, built around tearing down the traditional social class hierarchies and giving new power and new visibility to the working classes. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia had taken place earlier, in 1917. And at that time, the Soviet Union was working hard throughout the 20s and 1930s to build a socialist state until, as maybe you understand, Stalin sidetracked the process. So calling this movement National Socialism ensured that the focus would also be on Germans and on the German nation to the exclusion of others. Establishment of a third empire, the Third Reich, then thus amounted to both the unification of the German people across both class and state lines, and a reassertion of Germany's international leadership in human progress. Also during the Third Reich, the view that technology emanates from the deepest impulses of German culture and not from some sort of the disenchanted materialism of Western civilization gains full force. For example, the earlier writings of the engineer Max Weihe, who had written during the late 19th century, who was a famous German engineer who had developed the steam plow in England and disseminated its use around the world, gained great currency during the Third Reich. In his book, Living Forces, Weihe wrote, quote, "There was more Geist in a beautiful locomotive or electric motor than in the most elegant phrases of Cicero or Virgil. Technology is actually more cultural than culture itself." Can you understand the sense here of engineers who feel themselves empowered in the context of an emergent National Socialism? Even the writings of philosophers who wrote about technology were widely read by engineers through journals that discussed the relationship between technology and culture. One example was the paleontologist and natural philosopher Edgar Dacque, who wrote in his book, Nature and Redemption, quote, "Even pure technology, such as the construction of a machine, signifies a glimpse into a realization of a primal image through the medium of our own spirit. When we stand in awe and perhaps in terror of a functioning machine, what is it we are seeing other than a true homage to the ideational meaning of iron that, so to speak, received life from our spirit and shows us its inner countenance in symbols? It is art in the highest and noblest sense that we are seeing before us." In other words, technology as a realization of Geist. Engineers thus felt themselves invited into this movement called National Socialism. As the historian Herf elaborates, quote, "National Socialism was able to present itself as the force serving to liberate engineers from the distortions of exchange relations," that's referring to capitalism, "in the name of the glorious nationalist future, unsullied by crass commercialism." So National Socialism offered itself as an alternative to capitalism of further Western Europe and the United States. It offered a pathway for restructuring hierarchy in Germany, while at the same time reasserting German leadership, all without having to accept a form of capitalism that was oriented toward producing commercial goods for mass use. rather than toward quality, quality being the true measure of German progress. So, coming to power in the early 30s, Hitler's National Socialism achieved what was seen then as an economic miracle for Germany, primarily, of course, through military rearmament, and hence a return to full employment. The VDI, the Association of German Engineers, embraced this regime, and engineers readily adapted themselves to the new leadership, working with the formal ethic and overt ethic of political neutrality, which guaranteed their loyalty to the regime, and became the pathway, the means through which the engineers were able to ignore the abuses of the so-called non-Germans, especially the Jews, as these abuses began to appear. So it's in this sense then that engineers were in collaboration with anti-Semitic policies, sometimes willingly, sometimes explicitly, and sometimes just by claiming a political neutrality and a commitment to their technical work. Don't bother me with politics. Now, during this entire period of National Socialism, most power and authority was still located in the hands of the bureaucrats trained in law. But the engineers had established a new legitimacy and a stronger sense of identity. One way the Nazis challenged the old social hierarchy was by admitting the working classes, the lower classes, what in an earlier age had been called the commoners, to the institutes for specialized higher education. Also, these people were formally reclassified. They were promoted from being pupils to being students. The term students applying traditionally only to those enrolled at university. The Nazis also enabled some to gain admission to the higher technical institutes without having first attended an academic high school or taking the graduation exam that's called in the German context the Abitur, the graduation exam, a French invention, which provided basically a certificate for leaving, or a leaving certificate, and traditionally served as a prerequisite to admission into the higher technical institute or the university. Engineers graduating from these institutes in the past were pretty much guaranteed to be lower middle class because entrance came at age 16, which is understood in Germany as the intermediate maturity level. And they were required to show prior to entrance 2 years of practical training. So meanwhile, the students at the academic high schools were staying in school and took the examination at age 18. So these changes that took place under National Socialism were dramatic for engineers. At the conclusion of World War II, the German states were split into East and West Germany, with the goal in part of inhibiting the possibility of yet another German Empire. The fact that engineers were still subordinate to the university-trained civil servants during the Second Reich, Second Empire, the Weimar Republic, and the Third Reich made engineers basically pillars of post-World War II German society. Engineers finally gained stable status as an important category of German society. The Professional Engineering Society, the VDI, became more activist, as Gisbin describes it, now finally abandoning political neutrality and asserting socio-political responsibility as a key tenet of engineering practice. The specter of the Holocaust helps shape this development. Beginning in the 1970s, a horizontal cooperative model was established between these two types of engineers. The specialized institutes were formally elevated to the level of higher education, and graduates could, for the first time, go into the government civil service. In the 1980s, graduates for the first time became diplomaed engineers, permitted to receive the DIPL, the shorthand DIPL-ING on those business cards. Although, with the additional FH in parentheses, indicated that they had attended one of the specialized institutes rather than a technical university. Also, the VDI, the Professional Engineering Society, formally accepted the specialized institutes as the professional equivalent of the higher technical institutes. So, these changes were institutionalizing two alternative pathways for students into the specialized institutes. To understand this, let's step aside from the historical excavation to look briefly at the German system of education.